Yeah, I think now I will give the floor to next speaker, and I have to introduce her. Next speaker in my list is Ms. Mariam Safi from Afghanistan. Um, Ms. Mariam Safi is one of the few female researchers and experts from Afghanistan who has contributed widely in the field of rule of law, human security, and peace processes from the grassroots and gender perspective. Her research on topics such as role of Afghan women in peace process, transitional justice in Afghanistan, should not repeat old issues, people's perspectives on human security. Afghanistan has won human security has won her much national and international acclaim. Her unique outlook has widely been appreciated by organizations like Global Partnership for Prevention of Armed Conflict, Global Center on Cooperative Security, NATO, Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies, Peace Education and Development Foundation, School of Advanced International and Area Studies at the East China Normal University Center, and the Consortium of South Asian think tanks. She has regularly contributed to their understanding of the region and has participated in several working groups and conferences. Mariam's two groundbreaking research under the aegis of the Center for Conflict and Peace Studies included an assessment of the formal and informal justice relations in Afghanistan, a 6-province, 18-district, and 36-village assessment funded by USAID Rule of Law Program, and 4 provincial assessment of Afghanistan Peace and Reintegration Program in Kandahar, Baghdis, Baghlan, and Pakita, funded by Afghan High Peace Council. These assessments were the first of their kind and provided the academic and policy community with much needed baseline data, that which was largely missing in Afghanistan. Mariam was the Deputy Director of the Center for Conflict and Peace Studies based in Kabul, was the co-founder of Afghanistan Justice Organization Strategic Studies Program, and is the founding director of the Organization for Peace, Organization for Policy Research and Development Studies. She holds a Bachelor in Political Science and Masters in International Peace Studies from the United Nations mandated University of Peace. You have the floor, Mariam.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and experts, and honorable chairman. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Defense Seminar for having me here today. It's truly an honor and privilege to be given this opportunity to present to you some of my observations on the future of Afghanistan post NATO mission. I will talk about this topic in 3 formats: where we are currently, what are our challenges, and what has been set up to help us transition into this new phase. Now, without further delay, I'll get right into it. With the anticipated withdrawal of NATO-led ISAF forces from Afghanistan, by the end of this year, the country will leave behind its decade of transition, which started from 2001 till 2014, and will enter the decade of transformation from 2015 till 2024. Consequently, a quick key question on everyone's mind is, what will post-ISAF Afghanistan look like? Well, there are 2 dominant views towards this question. First, there are analysts who hold a very optimistic view. They contend that post-2014 Afghanistan will in fact continue to witness economic growth through the extraction of its mineral resources, regaining its position as a regional hub for trade and transit. They also cite achievements in the security transition process, pointing to the growing capabilities of the Afghan National Security Forces, which comprise of the army and the police, in leading security matters throughout the country. But on the other hand, analysts with a less optimistic view would argue that without continued US and NATO support, the conflict will protract, as the ANSF, the Afghan Security Forces, will not have the required capabilities, professionalism, and weaponry to fight a defiant insurgency. Furthermore, they argue that a reduction in international aid levels will deepen the country's fiscal gap. Subnational spoilers in the face of rampant lawlessness and corruption, poor governance, will begin to exploit its mineral industry. And these will combine to make Afghanistan once again highly vulnerable to interference from its neighbors. At this stage, both views paint a scenario that is very equally plausible. On 25th May 2014, just a few months ago, US President Barack Obama, during a visit to Afghanistan, announced that America's war in Afghanistan will come to a responsible end by the end of this year. In his speech, Obama identified a series of milestones, such as the dissemination of Al-Qaeda's leadership in tribal regions, reversing the Taliban's momentum, strengthening the capacity of Afghan armed forces, and improved social indicators. And lastly, the holding of a successful presidential elections this year, as indicators that pave the grounds for a responsible withdrawal. While no Afghan would dismiss the achievements of the past decade, or dispute international intentions in building rule of law, developing economic and social infrastructure, and instituting good governance, they would, however, caution that these achievements mask an array of challenges that will continue to plague the country and undermine international efforts in the decade to come. In 2001, after the international community intervened and they toppled the Taliban regime, the US immediately claimed victory and initiated a liberal state-building mission with the aim of building democratic institutions. But 2 years after, in 2003, the UN Secretary General and other UN officials claimed in a report that Afghanistan was still gripped by what they referred to as the triple threat: terrorism, factional warfare, and the drug trafficking. Though it may not have come as a surprise to hear these views back in 2003, it is certainly a surprise to know that 12 years later, we still continue to face these very same challenges, but in different degrees. While the threat of international terrorism, such as the presence of Al-Qaeda operatives, has declined, with perhaps, as NATO estimates, 40 to 60 operatives still in Afghanistan, the threat of the insurgency and drug trafficking has only increased over the years. And this has all led to creating a state that finds it increasingly challenging to meet the basic human security needs of its population. Thus, according to Afghans, the withdrawal timeline set by the international community does not represent a responsible end to the Afghan conflict. Rather, it represents a responsible end to the US and NATO conflict in Afghanistan. However, in recognition of these threats, the US and its NATO partners have confirmed that it would leave behind 9,800 troops after 2014 and continue to provide some form of financial assistance. Nevertheless, they have also been quick to caution that, and I quote, Afghanistan will not be a perfect place, and that it was not America's responsibility to make it one either. It is noteworthy to highlight this statement, as it is a drastic shift in US's earlier position on Afghanistan. In 2001, the US and its NATO partners assumed full ownership of Afghanistan's state-building process and offered Afghans little or no room to play a significant role in shaping it. But now, with the economic recession in the West, the international community has conveniently shifted its tone and looks to be ready to cut its losses and hand over all state-building responsibilities to locals. Suddenly, by mid this year, Afghans found themselves taking over state-building responsibilities they were never fully prepared for. Thus, as Afghanistan approaches the end of 2014, many are seriously asking whether the country is ready and able to assume ownership. A little on local ownership. External state builders often intervene in conflict zones with the aim of building functioning and self-sustaining state structures, which Soba also pointed to, which they can leave behind when they withdraw. In Afghanistan, this began with the agreement on the provisional arrangements in Afghanistan pending the re-establishment of permanent government institutions, signed in 2001, called the Bonn Agreement. The Bonn Agreement put in place a transitional administration to guide the country towards the establishment of a new constitution, adopted in 2003, followed by presidential elections in 2004 and parliamentary elections in 2005. These were the first democratic elections in the history of Afghanistan. However, these achievements stood on shaky foundation, as they were constantly opposed by informal structures the international community were simultaneously rebuilding and remobilizing at the subnational level. This reflected a top-down and elite-oriented approach at local ownership, which set in motion a centrifugal process that exacerbated internal cleavages, led to the re-emergence of old patronage networks, and fragmented the UN mission in Afghanistan from the beginning. By pursuing what some authors like to call the tight embrace, international donors, through its state-building agenda, controlled and determined the type of state that would be built in Afghanistan and how foreign aid would be spent in building it. In fact, it was not until 2012 that the international community finally agreed to channel 50% of foreign assistance through the Afghan Ministry of Finance. Nevertheless, it was a little too late in the coming. These factors have stifled the sense of ownership, the growth of local capacity, and local accountability structures. Therefore, with limited self-sustaining structures in place, after NATO's withdrawal, the country faces a real risk of failing to address both its current gaps and those that are likely to emerge in the future. The way forward, what is in place to assist Afghans address these challenges and move forward? In an effort to prevent this deterioration, the government, its international and regional partners have recommitted through several international and bilateral agreements and frameworks to assist Afghanistan politically, economically, and militarily beyond 2014 and into the decade of transformation. On 5th December 2011, 85 countries, 15 international organizations, and the Afghan government came together at the second Bonn Conference, in which marking the 10th anniversary of the first Bonn Conference that was signed in 2001. In contrast to Bonn I, which launched the state-building process that provided the framework for the decade of transition, Bonn II initiated a framework to guide the transformation of Afghanistan from a state in the making to a sovereign country that would now determine its own future. At the conclusion of this conference, the Afghan government met its sole interest, which was to ensure continued financial support beyond 2014. And the international community got its, which was conditions on its continued assistance. Hillary Clinton, former US Secretary of State, underscored this position on behalf of the international community when she stated that Afghans, and I quote, had to live up to their commitments. And this meant taking on difficult decisions to embrace reform, lead in their own defense, and strengthen an inclusive democracy rooted in the rule of law, the absence of which would jeopardize the aid that is to come to Afghanistan. Additionally, this conference provided and elaborated a framework on three key issues: the transition of security from NATO to Afghan forces by 2014, affirmation of international support in the aftermath of NATO's withdrawal, and the Afghan-led peace process. In terms of security transition, the international community at Bonn welcomed the determination of the Afghan people to combat terrorism and extremism and take responsibility for their own security. This was later reiterated at the Chicago summit that followed shortly after, where contributing nations to ISAF's mission in Afghanistan formally announced their withdrawal and reaffirmed their continued support. This support was both in terms of troop figures, as mentioned, and financial assistance. The US and some NATO countries offered to leave behind roughly 9,800 troops, who will assume a new mission by 2015 called Resolute Support, which will fall under the US Chief of Mission with no separate US or NATO military chain of command in the country. By the end of 2015, this number is predicted to shrink to 4,900. And after 2016, it will be further reduced to a few hundred US troops who will be stationed at the US Embassy in Kabul and will be mostly engaged in handling military sales to the country. From 2015 till 2016, meaning next year, the new mission, Resolute Support, will be engaged in handling, will be focused on training, advising, and assisting Afghan forces, meaning it will not conduct any patrols of Afghan territory, and the anti-Taliban mission will be completely in the hands of Afghan forces. However, about 20% of the US troops will continue to conduct counterterrorism operations in collaboration with Afghan forces. In terms of its financial support, the international community offered to raise $4.1 billion, with Afghanistan contributing $500 million to this annually to sustain the Afghan army and police from 2015 till 2024. However, this $4.1 billion will not support the current size of the ANSF, which was determined to cost approximately $6 billion, but a smaller force of 2,228,000 police force. The international community suggested to reduce the number of Afghan army and police forces to this size in order for the Afghan government to steadily rise its contribution to this cost while reducing its own. And by 2024, Afghanistan is expected to assume full responsibility of its Afghan force. The basis for Mission Resolute support was a successful security transition process, which started in July of 2011, and which will end by the end of this year. The security transition was created to allow for the gradual, through a 5-phase process, transfer of security responsibilities from NATO to Afghan forces. By June of 2013, this process was thought to be well on track, as Afghan forces had taken the lead role throughout the country, and NATO had moved into a supporting role. In concert with this transition, US and NATO forces also began to draw down troop levels to enable it to complete its mission by the end of this year. Thus, as of this month, NATO ISAF troop levels reduced to 44,000, of which 30,000 represent US troops, a figure that is likely to shrink to 22,000 by October. In the Chicago summit, the international community described the transition process as a success, stating that substantial improvements of the ISAF had enabled Afghans to take lead in all operations and security of regions that have been handed over to them. However, deeper examination would show that the shortcomings of the Afghan forces continue to be paramount. While Afghan forces have been widely credited for maintaining security on important occasions, such as the recent presidential elections in Afghanistan, and for preventing the Taliban from making significant territorial and kinetic gains, its performance after NATO still remains a question. About 35% of the Afghan forces do not re-enlist each year, which means that 1/3 of the force must be recruited every year. A poor vetting process has allowed for many disqualified and illiterate personnel to join, to which a huge chunk of international funding is spent to provide literacy training. Many units in the army suffer from lack of weaponry, spare parts, and fuel. Most frequent concerns include deficiencies in logistical capabilities, such as airlift, medical evacuation, resupply, and other associated functions, for which the army in Afghanistan still very much depends on NATO. While officials believe that by the end of 2014 most of these challenges will be addressed, this might be unrealistic, and it probably is unrealistic, even if the Afghan forces are reduced. In terms of international development support in the aftermath of NATO's withdrawal, despite 13 years of international economic development and trillions of dollars later, Afghanistan remains amongst the poorest 10 countries in the world. Why is this? Well, first, adoption of poor liberal economic policies. Afghanistan has one of the most liberal trade policies in the region, and too much of liberal economic patterns with negligible domestic protection laws has adversely impacted local businesses and production. Second, sequencing of security over development priorities. The lack of balance in the security and development nexus has always tended to see security matters being prioritized over development initiatives. As a result, the country did not witness aggressive development in the early part of the international intervention. It was only until about 2006 when the international community realized that its war efforts against terrorism was actually disenfranchising the Afghan people from its own government, as the latter did not have the capacity or the required funds to provide basic services to its people 5 years after the international intervention. And third, donor control over aid. Until 2012, the bulk of foreign aid was controlled and spent through foreign organizations instead of the Afghan government. This has not only prevented the development of local capacities, but has also largely been mismanaged and wasted. Afghans argue that their external partners' persistence on controlling funds led to the Afghan government missing several golden opportunities to build its economy. Instead, 90% of the Afghan government's budget now depends on foreign aid and money from the international donor community. And military spending makes up about 97% of the country's GDP. This has led to superficial hikes in the Afghan economy, which at certain points over the last 10 years have jumped to almost 22%, as it was based on international aid and not actual revenues generated by the Afghan government. Therefore, if international aid is not provided throughout the decade of transformation, with this in the backdrop, Afghanistan will witness the collapse of its economy. A snippet of what is to come can already be seen. In 2012, Afghanistan's GDP stood at 11.9%. But by 2013, a year short of international community's withdrawal, this figure dropped to 3.3%, and it is only expected to rise to 4.5%, which is also unlikely. In light of these economic gaps, the international community at the Tokyo Pledging Conference held in July of 2012 recognized that Afghanistan will have special, significant, and continuing but declining fiscal requirements that cannot be met by domestic revenues in the years following transition. It also acknowledged that with a population growth rate of about 2.8%, it would need strong economic growth at a rate of 6% at the very least to double Afghanistan's per capita GDP in a generation, about 22 years, in order to decrease poverty and improve development outcomes. To facilitate this, the international community pledged $16 billion in development sector to plug the country's fiscal gaps. But this has only been committed through to 2017, and so far, nothing beyond that. As part of this assistance, the Afghan government, aligned with the international community's commitment, developed towards self-reliance, a strategy for sustainable development, which focused on primary drivers of growth, enabling and leveraging the private sector investments, and sequencing and prioritizing these drivers to maximize impact. This implied making strategic investments in human capital, agriculture, and rural development, and most importantly, in the resource sector. Leveraging the resource sector is central to plugging Afghanistan's fiscal gap and has received considerable attention and planning so far. The extractive industry in Afghanistan, estimated to stand at approximately USD $3 trillion worth of mineral resources, has large deposits of copper, iron ore, gold, lithium, rare earths, and mineral fuel resources such as coal, oil, gas, and even perhaps uranium. The extraction of these resources will create employment, economic opportunities in the private sector, in the manufacturing sector, attract foreign investment, and provide South Asian countries access to much needed energy resources. If its extraction can be closely monitored, controlled, it could help wean Afghanistan off of its dependence on foreign aid while contributing to its economy in the long term. To this end, Afghanistan has created a national and regional resource corridors program to help it develop these resources. By taking advantage of the investments being made in the extractive industry, the regional corridors, RCs, envisions connecting Afghanistan to itself, to the region, and the rest of the world through promotion of interstate resource corridors. The concept of RCs follows the extractive industry's value chain, which was promoted by the World Bank. But the most important dimension of the RCs is construction of safe and reliable infrastructure to transport these minerals from the country's mines to buyers outside. In its 25-year economic plan, the Afghan government has prioritized linking Afghanistan to established rail lines that runs through Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. For its part, Afghanistan's future rail network and road infrastructure would prove vital to the extraction of its resources and to its economic expansion. However, for this to happen, Afghanistan needs to first establish a dependable railway network that extends beyond the mere 47 miles of track we have so far, and a road network that comprises of about 34,000 kilometers of roads. Moreover, the Afghan government and its international partners must manage the expectation and risks associated with the extractive industry. Risks such as delays in mining investments, corruption, poor governance, security, and government incapacity. And expectations. As such, there will be short-term results, and these results will be real, but only modest, while long-term impacts will be felt much later into the transformation decade. However, how can Afghanistan manage its expectations when international assistance is only provided till 2017, while long-term impacts are expected by 2020 and possibly beyond? Now coming to the peace process, the third component of the second Bonn Conference. A political solution of which reconciliation and reintegration are essential elements was considered a prerequisite in achieving peace and security in Afghanistan. This was recognized in the London Conference in 2010, which noted that reconciliation and reintegration with the insurgency, i.e. the Afghan Taliban, Haqqani Network, and Hizb Islami, should parallel the security transition process I talked about earlier. However, the peace process also defined as an Afghan-led and Afghan-owned process, marked the first attempt by the international community in actually promoting local ownership. Following the London Conference, the Afghan government held a consultative peace jirga, gathering of tribal elders representing all ethnicities and levels of the Afghan society to agree on a framework for these negotiations to take place. The peace jirga laid out 3 conditions that the insurgents would need to accept in order to be reconciled, and they included the renunciation of violence, the breaking of all ties with international donors, and the acceptance of the Afghan constitution. Since its creation, the peace process has witnessed the reintegration of over 8,000 foot soldiers at the subnational level. However, the reconciliation pillar has unfortunately not been as successful. Led by a group called the High Peace Council with 79 members, and who focus on negotiating with the top tier of the insurgency, this process has faced various challenges due to the meddling of external actors, the Taliban's military committee's refusal to enter talks, and the concerns domestically amongst women and different ethnic groups about the possible concessions that will be possibly made with the insurgency in return for an agreement. Initially, while the Taliban officially refused to enter talks, they have still maintained various informal exchanges with the Afghan and external actors. At one point, they even started to attend international meetings on Afghanistan, so to present their positions, such as the Track 2 meeting in Paris, the Academic Conference in Japan, and the meeting with members of the Northern Alliance. The Taliban even acknowledged the need to have a political address from where they could represent their positions officially. They began to voice flexibility in their annual statements, accepting some aspects of human rights and women's rights provision in the constitution. And in response, the Afghan government and the international community also began implementing various confidence-building measures, such as releasing Taliban prisoners, removing Taliban leaders from UN Security Council blacklist, and distinguishing the Taliban from Al-Qaeda by putting the former in a separate UN resolution that suggested a divide between the two. Also, we have gone from pursuing a political settlement with the insurgency to now a more favorable condition for the insurgency, which is a power-sharing possibility. Though these developments were considered positive and raised local hopes for peace talks, it was the opening of the Taliban political office in Doha in May of 2013 which was considered the most concrete signal that progress was being made in reconciliation efforts. However, this was short-lived, as all reconciliation efforts have been in Afghanistan. And this office shut immediately after it had opened. President Karzai halted the peace efforts after the Taliban put up a flag with the Islamic Emirate on it and hung their flag. Karzai blamed the US and Qatari government for interfering in its peace efforts and allowing the Taliban to use this occasion to set up a government in exile instead of a political address from where negotiations could take place. In response to Karzai's actions, the Taliban cut communication with the government and the US, and there was a lull in this process. Reports now suggest that clandestine talks have resumed, but not yet led to the reopening of the office. A primary reason for the failures of the reconciliation process have been the meddling of external actors, as I mentioned, in a process that was stated by them to be Afghan-led and Afghan-owned. This reflects what was mentioned yesterday by the Honorable Minister of External Affairs, Professor Paris, who said that if reconciliation is to be sustainable, it must emanate from the traditional and long-held beliefs that are developed and consolidated at home. The Afghan government has long held this view and stressed that all talks should be led and coordinated through them, suggesting that anything outside of this framework would be taken as blatant interference. But the negligence of the international community in respecting this view and confusions at home within the Afghan government has proven to be a great source of tension between Karzai and his international partners. And lastly, regional cooperation, a central thread bringing together all of these agreements and commitments, is important to mention here. The Afghan government has made regional cooperation central to meeting key priorities in the security and economic sector. As a result, Afghanistan has become a focal point of many regional processes that have brought together countries surrounding it to recognize its role as a land bridge in the heart of Asia, connecting South Asia, Central Asia, Eurasia, in the Middle East. In order to promote transit, transportation, and investment in the region, develop cross-border initiatives for equitable exploitation of shared resources of hydropower, and improve efforts against organized cross-border crime, Afghanistan has made great strides in integrating itself into the region. Its various trade agreements with countries like Pakistan, India, Iran, Sri Lanka, and Central Asian republics have also done a lot in establishing diplomatic ties and cooperation in the economic and social sectors, and in offering exchanges and experiences in a variety of fields. For instance, during President Karzai's very recent visit to Sri Lanka, where he had a very positive meeting with His Excellency President Rajapaksa, he stressed that Sri Lanka's achievements towards peace and stability offered a good sample for Afghanistan to learn from. Afghanistan has also signed several strategic partnership agreements and joint declarations to ensure that cooperation in terms of economic and security also continue. This has seen countries like India offer training programs to Afghan national security forces, which has been well appreciated. However, while the region maintains that it has common goals and interests, mistrust and dissidence amongst South Asian countries continues to overshadow these prospects. Simply put, none of the countries are ready to compromise their individual security interests for the sake of economic interests. And in conclusion, as you can see, it is very difficult to envision Afghanistan's future after the withdrawal of NATO. Ever-changing ground realities and a diverse set of dilemmas portray different scenarios. However, even the international community, on the best of days, cautions to not seem overly optimistic. And this was summed up by Obama when he recently acknowledged that there would never be a point at which the international community could say, this is all done, this is perfect. But by this, what Obama is inferring is that the Afghanistan that will be left behind will be stable enough for them to depart, but still loaded with troubles. Stable enough may not be enough to mitigate Afghanistan's declining economy, contain the insurgency, and sustain existing social indicators. As it was mentioned during the presentations yesterday, none of the developments we see today in countries like Sri Lanka would have been possible if terrorism was still alive and kicking, as Professor Paris mentioned yesterday. Thus, how can we say that these commitments and pledges made that I've just described to you will be enough to ensure the irreversibility of modest gains when terrorism is still alive and kicking in Afghanistan? In the face of scarce local capacities, insecurity, and widespread corruption, and rising public spending and declining government revenues, international pledges will only provide short-term solutions. Frankly speaking, these pledges are unable to address the mismatch between the growing Afghan expenditures and the international expectations of declining aid. Nevertheless, if Afghanistan, along with its regional neighbors and international partners, takes stock of these realities and evaluate economic and security and political issues in regional terms and create regional responses, then perhaps a more promising scenario could emerge. But at this stage, before I end, I feel that I probably portrayed a very negative image of what is to come post-2014, to say the least. But I don't want to leave you with that lasting impression. So I would like to share with you a quote that I often recite in my presentations, since it captures the essence of Afghanistan so well for me. This was a statement told to me by a very distinguished political personality in Afghanistan, His Excellency Ambassador Masood Khalili, who was severely injured in what was the very first suicide attack to take place in Afghanistan, incidentally just days before 9/11. He says ever so eloquently, when I speak to him and I get very frustrated with what's happening in the country, and he looks at me and he says, Afghanistan is like me, a body full of shrapnel, but a heart full of hope. And with this hope, Afghans will embark on the journey that is to come in the decade of transformation. And I'd like to leave you with that thought. Thank you very much.